Good morning, students. Yesterday, we had seen the impact of non-cooperation movement in the countryside, that is, the rural part of India, and the role that was being played by different people at different levels to really galvanize the mass support and just to do uh, what they thought would be best to ensure that the British leave India. Students, you have to understand certain things, that this kind of a movement, which was a completely non-violent movement, uh, and then trying to get results out of non-violence, this was not attempted in not just in India before, but never in the history. If you read all the revolutions of the world, it was never attempted in any part of the world before. So no one was sure about what the outcome would be, whether it would be effective, not effective, or they are just wasting their time. No one was sure of it. So different people were making different efforts from their own end, and some of the leaders, that is, who later became to be leaders, of course, here in this paragraph. Let's start from today. That is, in June 1920, Jawaharlal Nehru began going around the villages in Awadh. Awadh is, of course, areas around Lucknow today, and talking to the villagers and trying to understand their grievances. By October, the Awadh Kisan Sabha was set up and headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, Baba Ramchandra, and a few others. Now, within a month, over 300 branches had set up in the villages around the region. Now, what does it essentially tell you? By this time, non cooperation had not been launched. But then just see how soon and how fast this movement had spread. That basically giving you an idea about the dissatisfaction and resentment which the people of that area, that the farmers of those areas had against the oppressive regime of the Britishers, where it was becoming extremely difficult for them to pay the taxes and also take care of their own family. So, when the non cooperation movement began the following year, the effect of the Congress was to integrate the Awadh peasant struggle into the wider struggle. The peasant movement, however, developed into forms that Congress leadership was unhappy with. And as the movement spread, students, this is very important because this is the same thing and that happened in the other movement, there were, or rather, there were similar incidents in different parts of the country even after this, which led to a different kind of mood within the Congress, and they had to cancel many things. So what happened here? What happened was, as the movement spread in 1921, the houses of talukdars and the merchants were attacked. Bazaars were looted and grain hoards were taken over. In many places, local leaders told peasants that Gandhiji had declared that no taxes were to be paid and that land was to be redistributed among the poor. Students, now you have to understand one thing, that when you do these kind of things where you attack the talukdar and the merchants and you start looting the bazaars and the grains, now of course these people might have been responsible for a lot of evils within the society at that point in time, and you definitely, many of the poor peasants of India, considered to be in hand with the British administration, and naturally had a role to play in their oppression. But then looting the bazaars and burning property is essentially vandalism, and it is taking law into the into your own hands. So now this is something which was not at all desired, and this was not something which was appreciated by the main leaders of Congress party, especially Mahatma Gandhi, who felt that this is completely against the ideals of non-violence. So if you're looting property, burning property, that cannot be non-violence. So, and that is the reason why they had to call that off. And so different people, it also gives you an idea about different people had a different impression and expectation of these movements, because because these were the early years, the things were not very clear to many of the people even in India. even on the streets, no one was clear about it except probably few people within the Congress party. So here in another forest region, the colonial government had closed large forest areas, preventing people from entering the forest to graze their cattle or to collect fuel wood and fruits. Uh, this enraged the hill people. Not only were their livelihoods affected, but they felt that the traditional rights had been denied. The students, you have to understand one very, very important thing that the British started doing for the first time in India. Um, in early times, because India happens to be, you have to understand, it's a very old civilization. In India, people always had the right to to lead the kind of life they wanted to. If they wanted an urban life, they went to the cities and towns. If they wanted the rural life, they would rather stay in villages. But then there was a huge segment of Indian population which was neither interested in the urban life of towns and neither was into farming and owning lands and living in villages. That is essentially not into those kind of regular lives. So there were many people in India at that point in time who would rather live in jungles. They depended on whatever they got from jungles, which was definitely plenty much, and they were happy about it. They were not interested in building businesses, and they were not interested in building large houses for themselves. They were just happy with whatever deadwood they would get from the jungles, and whatever fruits they could get, and whatever they could grow on their own, and they were happy about it. And this segment of population, the Indian population, had been left untouched almost through the history. In fact, the one thing is very interesting, that even the Mughals did not touch them. Okay, even the Mughals, when their crops failed because some poor monsoons or dry season, even the Mughals never ventured into these forests or the forests to extract money or the tax from them. They were almost left to lead a life they wanted to. Okay, so even Mughals did not interfere with them. But for the first time, the Britishers would not spare them. For the first time, the British felt that this segment of Indian population has been left untouched for a very, very long period of time. They have not been paying taxes for a very long period of time. They just collect fire, if there is the fuel wood, they collect the fruits, they graze their own cattle within those jungles, and basically indulging in activities which British saw that this activity can also be converted into profits. And they started interfering with their lives, something which was extremely resented by the people. And that also led to a huge amount of unrest. And so you can read some of it. It is essentially about certain other leaders who were a part of the same movement in different parts of India. Now, Swaraj and the plantations. Uh, Workers too had their own understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion of Swaraj. So it was not just that the people who were in the jungles, who saw this as an opportunity once the British started interfering in their lives, that they saw this as an opportunity that they should also start fighting for the freedom and their own independence. But even the workers who used to work in different industries in India at that point in time, they also started having a very unsettling feeling about how things were happening under the British, and then they were looking for a leadership for a very long period of time. In fact, that some kind of leadership that would understand their plight and their problems, and some kind of leadership that was credible enough to be supported by them. So, for plantation workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely in and out of the confined spaces in which they were enclosed, and it meant retaining a link with the villages from where they had come. Under the Inland Immigration Act of 1859, plantation workers were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission, and in fact, they were rarely given such permission. Students, once the school opens, I will explain this in better detail on the board. But just try and understand what they are talking about is uh, uh, since tea plantation happened in India. That is in the early 1900s. That is around 1810, 1820, when 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 Indians started growing tea. Tea is not something which is an indigenous plant. It is not something which we Indians have known through our history, through our very, very long history. We have never come across tea, something which was always talked about, and it was always considered to be a very revered plant and a very famous activity, a very popular activity rather for the Chinese and the Japanese. But Indians had never been fond of tea because, for a simple reason, they did not know that it existed. Now, tea was introduced in India by the British because the British were very fond of tea. Okay, they were extremely fond of tea, and not just that, the British in India were extremely fond of tea, but the British in England were also very fond of tea, and the British across the world were very fond of tea. So, so what the British did around the world, all the countries that they colonized, whether it was in Africa, whether it was in Asia, they started promoting the cultivation of tea. Whether when the British, if you are aware, British were the rulers of Sri Lanka as well. So Sri Lankan tea is there. They were rulers in Kenya. So you go to Kenya in Africa, then they have the Kenyan tea. Uh, you know, and everywhere where the climate could afford and the growth of tea plants and tea plantation, the British patronized tea cultivation. Now, but the workers under those plantation, they were kept under extreme amount of discipline and extreme amount of uh, suppression. Not much of the laws. They were under civil law. Not much of freedom was given to them. They could not leave the campuses. And because it is a very, very labor intensive thing, tea plantation is, even today, if you go to the tea gardens of Assam, Darjeeling, it is a very, very it is a very, very hard-working thing, of course, like all the farmings, and just like all the different kinds of farming, it is a very, very human-involved activity. Not much machinery is used even today. So naturally, the different people from different parts of India were brought into these tea plantations to work against their will. Okay, because hundreds and thousands of people are needed to develop tea plantations, and naturally the British um, brought it from different parts of India, and this decision was never going to be popular because you have basically uprooted the people of from one part of the country, and you've transported them to some other part of the country, and they are being kept there against their will. They have been compelled to do a job which they never wanted to do. So even the laborers in those tea gardens in Assam, they felt the need that this was the time that they could rally behind the the satyagraha and the non-violent, non-cooperation movement of Mahatma Gandhi, and they could also fight for their own independence. Okay, we shall continue. Thank you.